Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Once again, please welcome Dr. Jerome Dobson.
This year, 57,000 unaccompanied children showed up on the U.S. border seeking asylum from violence in their homelands. Most of them came not from Mexico or some vague Hispanic part of the world. They came from Central America, specifically the Northern Triangle of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. What could possibly compel parents to send children on a journey so perilous even for adults? Why these countries? Remarkably few children came from Nicaragua next door. Why not? Even within the Northern Triangle, why does one community yield when drug lords come calling while another community resists? How can some communities address population pressures peacefully while others cannot? The quality of remaining stable in the face of stress is called resilience. AGS was already in Central America studying resilience when those children left home. Our sixth Bowman expedition, called Central America Indígena, is a two-pronged effort to understand the geographic factors, both human and physical, that encourage resilience throughout the 7 states of Central America. At the regional scale, we examine the usual socioeconomic factors, but also physical geography, land rights, and land tenure. Land reform has been central to Latin American revolts and revolutions throughout history. One valuable byproduct of our work is a vastly improved GIS that can be used by citizens, agencies, and researchers of all disciplines. To illustrate, imagine that different state agencies in New York use base maps with county boundaries that differ from one another by 10 miles or more. That's the sort of correction we're making in formal collaboration with government agencies and private citizens. At the local scale, we drill down to ensure that we understand what those regional data and correlations really mean. We use participatory research mapping, PRM, to teach indigenous people to map their own resources, lands, and land uses with GIS. We strictly adhere to the AGS guidelines for ethical conduct of foreign field research. Our base of operations is Honduras, and now we're expanding to Guatemala and Costa Rica, where we'll be collaborating with geographers from Cuba as well. We lead joint projects through written agreements with Honduran government agencies, the National Teaching University, indigenous federations, the United Nations, World Bank, and NGOs. Peter Herlihy, professor of geography at the University of Kansas, is in charge. He pioneered PRM methodology in this same region back in 1992 and recently was honored as AGS's first Bowman Scholar. If you happened to be in Honduras last week, you might have seen an hour-long TV show in Tegucigalpa or heard radio shows live from Puerto Lempira that extolled our work. If you had gone with me in September, you would have seen what it means for Honduras to have the highest murder rate in the world. In Valle de Angeles, my host said, "Gracias a Dios, the violence has not reached us yet." Then while I was there, 3 people were murdered in one night. Traveling with Peter Herlihy almost anywhere in the region, you would have seen how lasting and appreciated his work is. You would have seen scholars and farmers stop him in the street or plaza or conference room to bask in the memory of working with him decades ago. We were invited to observe a symposium to resolve a violent conflict between 2 indigenous peoples. Deep in the tropical rainforest, we saw indigenous leaders debate vital matters while pointing repeatedly to maps that Peter had made with 8 of those leaders back when they were young. Their formal agreement asked AGS and the University of Kansas for further assistance. Waiting to board a plane in Puerto Lempira, you would have learned why we do what we do. With no security standing in her way, a girl about 12 years old milled about beneath the wings with a toddler at her hand. Grad student Taylor Tappan, who speaks Spanish and local Miskitu, felt a tug at his arm. Please take her with you to Tegucigalpa, the 12-year-old girl offered. Her mother will meet you at the airport. No one believed that her mother would be there. Since 2005, we've conducted Bowman expeditions in Mexico, the Antilles region, Colombia, Jordan, Kazakhstan, and Central America. My son, an Army doctor, now a lieutenant colonel, was stationed in Fallujah, Iraq during the dark days there. I asked myself how in the hell we got ourselves into such a mess. I concluded that the greatest single factor was geographic ignorance. I calculated that AGS could send a team of geographers to every country in the world for only $125 million per year, a pittance compared to any other means of gathering such intelligence, generating so much goodwill, educating the American public, and building a cadre of foreign experts to be called on in future crises. I cast a broad net and ultimately found more than $7 million. CA Indígena is funded by DoD's prestigious Minerva Initiative for University Research. We're still looking for the rest. And now I will introduce our next session, The Future Energy Landscape. We are fortunate to have an esteemed panel of internationally recognized experts. Professor Michael Bradshaw is Professor of Global Energy at the University of Warwick. Mr. Niel Golightly is Vice President of Shell Oil, and Mr. James Scrivener is President and CEO of National Solar. Let's begin with Mr. Golightly. And if you will, and simultaneously, if the other speaker will join us at the...
Thanks very much. It's really a very great privilege to be here and to play at least a small part in maybe perhaps a business part in mapping out the American Geographic Society's expedition to 2050. And as I prepared for this session for today, I was struck by the degree to which energy is in fact fundamentally very much rooted in geography, in political geography, in physical geography, certainly in political and economic geography. And of course, it's no coincidence that some in this room, including Chris Tucker and Michael, have actually been part of the work at Shell that I'm here to share with you. But first, next slide, please. I only have a very few slides. Very few of them look like this. This is the SEC's way of reminding you, please don't make any investment decisions based on what I'm about to tell you. And if my lawyers come to see you, assure them that you read this word for word. Next one, please. This is the only map I'm going to show you, and as you can tell, I've got a lot of catching up to do with the people in this room. And I'm guessing that a room full of geographers will not be entirely unfamiliar with the lines from Jonathan Swift's 1733 poem, A Rhapsody, and I quote, "So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er uninhabitable towns place elephants for want of towns." Now, in the age of satellite cameras and Google Maps, there is surely not a single square inch of the terrestrial globe that remains a mystery, although in conversations I've had this morning and last night, I'm assured that actually there are parts of the world that haven't been measured down to the last square inch. But for sure, the temporal globe, the map we need to explore the future, is another matter. Shell has long taken a very, very keen interest in discovering at least the faint outlines of what that future may look like, and that's because our investments run to the tens of billions of dollars for each project. They're designed to last 30, 40, 50 years, and they need to withstand all the economic, political, technological, and market surprises the future can throw at us. Next slide, please. And can you just go ahead and do the build on this one, please? And to make our decisions, go ahead, next one. There we go, and one more. Thanks. So to make our decisions as resilient as we possibly can, we have, since roughly the middle of the 1970s, turned to scenarios development to help us fill those gaps. It's important to stress that scenarios are not forecasts. A forecast starts from a single point, a single assumption about today's world, and applies a number of assumptions to a model for how the world may unfold over time to arrive at a single point forecast of a particular circumstance in the future. Scenarios, on the other hand, start with a range of current realities, and they explore multiple pathways to arrive at a range of number of possible futures. Possibly the best way to think about the difference is to imagine packing for a vacation. If you pack shorts and flip-flops and sunglasses and sunblock based on a single specific forecast for the destination that you're about to go to, chances are, by definition, you will have packed the wrong thing. On the other hand, if you pack an assortment of clothes based on a range of plausible scenarios, perhaps you throw the odd sweater in or the book for a rainy day, you're going to stand a much better chance of having the right things you need when you get to that range of plausible futures. And it's this resiliency that Shell is trying to build into its decision-making by taking the scenarios approach. Next slide, please. And in the current work, the scenarios team considered a number of lenses, or what we're calling diagnostic tools, and we call them paradoxes and pathways. The prosperity paradox points to a number of to the economic benefits of wealth on one hand. That's about quality of life, health, education, community well-being, all those good things, and the stresses, on the other hand, that wealth can create: environmental impact, social divisions, competing political landscapes. The leadership paradox refers to the tension between strong, coordinated, and centralized leadership on one hand, and diverse, distributed, and localized leadership on the other. An African proverb comes to mind here: to go fast, go alone, but to go far, go together. How the world grapples with the growing stresses will involve how well we both go fast and far, or to go both alone and together. And the connectivity paradox calls out the bold promise of, for example, the digital age to stimulate knowledge, creativity, collaboration on one hand, but on the other hand also to stimulate balkanization in our thinking, to drive herd behavior, perhaps even to overwhelm and confuse us with data. The pathways, next slide please. And go on to the next one. There we go. The pathways represent two distinctly different routes that a country or a business or an economy, even a sports team or a family might take as it navigates challenges and opportunities. An organization with high social economic resilience will typically enjoy room to maneuver. And here mounting stresses, this is on the top, and here mounting stresses and an early crisis can spark quick and reasonable response, an adjustment or reform that sets things back on a stable pathway. An example of room to maneuver might include a high-tech company, perhaps like an Amazon, that spots competitive risks and opportunities quickly, invests to capture those opportunities, and encourages the kind of flexibility and experimentation that finds a way to a successful new product or service. An organization, on the other hand, trapped in transition, will fail to respond to that early crisis. Its institutions may be crippled with anxiety, with denial and conflict versus innovation, imagination and leadership, and it will drift and decline until an existential crisis forces either a write-off or a reset and eventual collapse. One might say that the Eurozone's response to its lingering economic crisis could be an example of trapped transition, or perhaps the international community's very listless response to the climate threat. Next one, please. Of course, any scenario worth its salt has a name. Some of you may remember our scramble and blueprint scenarios from a few years ago, and our most recent scenarios, by happy coincidence with today's theme around geography, are mountains and oceans. They are wider ranging than previous Shell scenarios. They take in global economic, political, cultural, and technological factors across the 21st century. They go out to actually 2060 on energy systems and 2100 for some of the developments linked to climate and renewable energy. Next one, please. To start with mountains. Mountains suggests a relatively static world. The broad outlines of power remain recognizable over the decades. Change, when it does happen, tends to be driven from the top by an elite that seeks to preserve the status quo and that takes a very long view of the horizons. The core pattern we could see here is how advantage drives more advantage. Influence typically remains concentrated in the hands of the already powerful, and those who do rise through the inequality gap do so through established channels like sports, business, popular culture that tend to reinforce the prevailing ideology. The structures and institutions of power in this possible mountains world remain stable, they remain rigid, and they remain unreformed. This rigidity actually hampers collective decision-making and slows broad-based economic growth. This is not necessarily as bleak as it sounds. With fewer power brokers and established bilateral relationships, some progress can be possible in what we call secondary policy areas, when interests align. For example, authorities worried about political unrest in stressed cities might align with the interests of developers to create smart, compact cities with better infrastructure, higher quality of life, smarter use of resources. Next slide, please. In energy terms, the relatively sluggish economic pace we might see in a mountains world means a relatively relaxed energy demand, which may ease even more with the disciplined top-down energy policies. Those national energy policies unlock the potential of lower carbon natural gas from unconventional sources, even outside North America, and as a result, gas becomes the backbone of the global energy system by the 2030s. CO2 emissions are moderated a little by the slower overall economic growth and by the replacement of coal with cleaner natural gas and the early deployment of carbon capture and storage. Next slide, please. In more visual terms, here's what a mountains energy future could look like. Oil demand, here in red, tops out around 2030 and starts to taper off. Coal's growth, in black, slows down starting sometime around 2020. The slack is taken up largely by an increase in the use of natural gas, here in green, and as you can see, nuclear in yellow starting to pick up some steam around 2030 as well, something you might expect with a strong top-down policy. Next slide, please. Oceans, on the other hand, is much more volatile. It's a bottom-up world of empowered populations driving structural reforms and even more economic activity. Participation in leadership extends beyond the few powerful incumbents. Distrust of big governments and big business waxes, and the ability of big institutions to impose long-term policy frameworks correspondingly wanes. The tides of power, money, and knowledge ebb and flow much more spontaneously in an oceans world. Growing social media connections drive the spread of information, but also the spread of social volatility and the balkanization of opinion. Reforms unleash new demand-led productivity and growth, but also insatiable appetite for more of what others have. In consumer terms, that may mean more cars, more white goods, more air conditioning, more air travel, and consequently more demand on resources. Meanwhile, short-cycle consumerism and activist special interest hinder the kind of secondary policy development needed to support, for example, investment in smart urban development. Next one. In this possible future oceans world, in energy terms, the far more brisk economic activity, especially in emerging economies, exerts much more demand-side pressure. At the same time, the supply side is constrained by political turbulence and relatively weak, relatively unstable and short-term policy frameworks. That means that higher energy prices, while they unlock more costly conventional resources and drive more user efficiency, aren't supported by the kind of societal consensus that policy would and policy that would enable new and alternative energy sources. So liquid fuels and coal flex their muscle well into the century, and the picture only really begins to change when climate shocks finally force dramatic intervention and adaptation of solar power and CCS. Next one, please. In visual terms, oil holds its own in an oceans world well past the middle of the century. So does coal. Natural gas plays a much more modest role than it does in mountains, and nuclear power is stifled by the lack of policy support. Solar and other renewables abruptly take off around 2040 or 2050 as the implications of climate change become impossible to ignore and decades of strong economic growth force the search for additional energy sources. Next one, please. Here's a very high-level example of how mountains and oceans compare in purely energy terms. After the dominance of first biomass, then coal and oil, we see in a mountains world gas becoming the largest source of supply as early as the 2030s. In oceans, on the other hand, a very freewheeling, fast-growing economy and relatively little adult supervision means that oil and coal continue to dominate until we see renewables kicking in later in the century. They are the cheapest, most available energy sources in the medium term. Next slide, please. Of course, the global comparisons between mountains and oceans mask some dramatic regional differences in how each scenario plays out. Here, for example, we see oceans, in oceans a relatively flat line for total energy demand in the OECD countries, with sharply declining use of oil and coal driven by lower population growth, more energy efficient technologies, and shift in economic base. The rest of the world, of course, we see energy demand accelerating along a very steep curve. And these effects are connected. The accelerating supply-demand pressure in the developing world actually helped drive the energy transition in the OECD. Next one, please. I was struck by Professor Balk's comments this morning on urbanization. One of the most significant drivers of the future energy landscape is, in fact, urbanization. In either scenario, the number of people living in cities around the world is set to increase from something like 3.6 billion today, or in 2010, to around 6.3 billion in 2050. And as Professor Balk said, 60% of that urban growth will happen in sub-Saharan Africa, China, and India alone. The equivalent of one city of a population of 1.4 million people is likely to spring up every week for the next 30 years. Shell Scenarios team has done a supplementary work on the impact of urbanizations on tomorrow's landscape, starting with an analysis of various urban archetypes shown here, looking at a range of developmental pathways and understanding what this massive concentration of people in cities will mean for energy use. Among other things, and I certainly won't go into the details today, but among other things, their work suggests that well thought out city development may actually represent a powerful ingredient recipe for meeting the energy needs of 9 billion people with less carbon than we produce today. Next one, please. Which leads to a troubling punchline in all of this, one that was highlighted by Jim Baker a little bit earlier when he talked about the very tight relationship between energy and climate. Most of you will recognize the classic greenhouse gas curves. Mountains world as a scenario is not necessarily an attractive world in terms of liberal democratic expectations, but its emissions shown here in green offer a quicker path to zero by the end of the century than the oceans world. Emissions in the oceans world, by contrast, shown here in blue, also approach zero by the end of the century, but the curve is higher, the total emissions greater. Neither pathway, however, achieves the 2-degree C limit on global temperature change that most scientists and governments, and by the way, Shell as well, agree is the point at which climate-related impacts start to become critical. And that curve is shown in the red dotted line. But keep in mind that these scenarios are based on plausible assumptions today. The question becomes not just what decisions we might make based on what is plausible, but what implausible things should be considered to close this gap? What implausible things should be done to close that gap? In fact, my CEO, Ben Van Beurden, stood on that spot right there 2 months ago and called as forcefully as anybody has in this industry for a global price on carbon and a number of other steps to address climate change. And perhaps the deal struck last week between the US and China, as symbolic as it may appear, is an example of one of those implausible things that we may hope for going forward. Next one. So just a few takeaways to sum up. And this is my language, not necessarily Shell's. The dilemmas presented in almost any conceivable future are long-term, wide, and deep, and they cross multiple sectors and multiple issues. They go to the heart of how our society, our economy, the biosphere, and political systems work. Next one. They are existential. They're not just political. Arguments based on short-term special interests, on shifting the burden, on narrow view of consequences, on simply validating ideological positions could undermine the safety of future generations. Next one. Intentional choices require conscious trade-offs. Scenarios give us a tool to see some of those choices and trade-offs, but there are no easy answers. Both of our current scenarios have positive and negative aspects. Intelligence requires selecting among competing goods and bads, not finding a right answer or a wrong answer. Next one. The path to 2 degrees will be hard, but we should not rule out the ability of society to produce discontinuous innovations that could change the definition of what is plausible. Next one. What we might be able to do tomorrow should not condemn what we can do today. We need to avoid getting trapped in transition. The energy and climate space, we know that gas, carbon pricing, efficiency, biofuels, carbon capture and storage are among the best tools at our disposal today, and it would be foolish to condemn those things in light of the distant promise of hydrogen, solar, and other solutions that we need to be striving for tomorrow. And finally, we are bees as well as chimps. According to some evolutionary biologists, humans are a eusocial species for which the survival of the community is as imperative in evolutionary terms as the survival of the individual. A look back across the millennia suggests that the human race has collectively been more ingenious and resilient than we give ourselves credit for, and that perhaps is cause for hope. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Niel. Thank you. And now Jim Scrivener.
Good morning, thank you. I'm going to actually start with a real brief geography anecdote. My aunt and uncle moved to Central Florida, where I hail from. They were driving through Central Florida down a highway, and they saw a road sign, a city that was spelled Kissimmee. So they began debating about the correct pronunciation of this city with one another. My uncle decided to be clever and pull over for some lunch and find out what the proper pronunciation of this town was. So they stopped for lunch, and during ordering their meal, he asked a young lady, he said, "Would you do me a favor? My wife and I are debating about how to pronounce the name of the place where we are. Would you tell me the name of the place where we are? Say it slowly so that we can know how to properly pronounce this." And she said, "Sure, Burger King." Okay, thank you for inviting me, Chris, and the AGS. I certainly appreciate being here. You can go ahead and flip to my first slide, thanks. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the history of energy in America and in the world. Approximately 1.7 million years ago or earlier, according to Professor James Stanley, Homo erectus, our immediate evolutionary predecessor, masters the use of fire. So thus begins man's hunter-gatherer relationship with energy. We find things to burn, we burn them to produce energy for about 1.7 million years. Next slide, please. Along the way, you can go ahead and hit it again. Yes. Next, please. Fossil fuels enabled an alternative to deforestation. So in the 18th century, specifically with coal initially, it was readily available in surface seams, it was usable in its native form, and it enabled the Industrial Revolution. So there's no question that fossil fuels have been a huge player in the growth and the prosperity of mankind on this earth. Their ability to enable us to prevent chopping down every tree in the country and burning it for fuel was helpful to us. Their use has also spread across virtually every economic sector. Next slide, please. And enabled the industrial age. So in virtually every field of technology, fossil fuels and energy infrastructure have enabled us to move forward in terms of technology. Energy is fundamental in our lives in terms of economic development, in terms of how we interact with the world around us. Next, please. Unfortunately, it wasn't all good, right? We came to find out along the way, please, you can click the next two, that burning of fossil fuels releases toxic air and water pollution. So we pollute our water and our air when we burn fossil fuels. And as our panels today have elucidated for us, we face the threat of planetary ecological destruction as a result of climate change from burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So obviously, we require a change. We require a new look. Next slide, please. This is a map of our U.S. energy infrastructure provided by the EIA. It's actually a division of the U.S. government, I think a civilian government agency. This map shows the location of our current energy resources, generally speaking, our energy infrastructure. And one of the important things to note, I think, from a geographical perspective, energy is a geospatial enterprise. It's resource-driven, resource-built. We build energy generation where we need it, where we use it, near the load centers. Generally speaking, you have to build it near water because you're going to need water to cool your turbines. Generally speaking, you want to build it someplace where you can transmit that energy to your load centers. So where we are, our energy infrastructure follows. So once again, sort of that fundamental relationship between mankind and the use of our energy resources and the landscape around us, the geography of energy, so to speak. Next slide, please. So looking at some idea of today's energy numbers, what does the U.S. do? So in the United States, we generate a little more than 20,000 terawatt hours of energy a year. About 4,100, roughly 4,000 terawatt hours is consumed. Well, what's the big gap? Losses, believe it or not. 61 to 68% of our electricity is lost in the form of transmission losses, losses to heat, losses to energy efficiency. So the greatest gains to be made, obviously, are in terms of energy efficiency, are improving the system at which we utilize energy. We see today about 69% of our fuel mix in the United States comes from fossil fuels, continuously. Again, the idea of being an inefficient system. And current oil and gas leases in the U.S. total about 230 million acres of land. So when we look at how we use our land, we use our land to generate power, we use our land to transmit power, we use our land to find fuel, to burn, to make power, right? All of these impacts. And according to the IPCC, they require an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in the United States. It's a lot. We produce more greenhouse gas emissions today than at any time before in our history. In fact, if you look at the global footprint of the United States in terms of carbon, it's a lot greater than just what's here domestically because we outsource a lot of our manufacturing. So we have countries all around the world manufacturing goods with carbon footprints that we use. So from a consumption standpoint, we are one of the largest users on the earth in terms of greenhouse gas intensive energy. Now these three tables sort of paint the picture, in my opinion, of the current energy usage in the United States and what the impact that has on our land. And the first table is greenhouse gas emissions by fuel type. So obviously, we heard from our second panel some of the dangers of climate change. There's our greenhouse gas emissions by fuel type. On the left side, you can see coal, oil, gas, combined cycle natural gas. And then they the table contemplates some of those fossil fuel resources using carbon capture and storage technologies, which would obviously greatly decline the greenhouse gas emissions of those fuel sources. The second table, another thing a lot of people don't know in the U.S., is our thermoelectric industry is the largest consumer of water in the United States. So our energy system uses more water than anything else. So when we look at our future uses of resources and our future needs, water enters into that equation pretty heavily. The third graph there is more of a little graphic that demonstrates not talking about greenhouse gas emissions, but talking about toxic air emissions, separate issue. Our electric power industry is the greatest producer of toxic air emissions in the United States. So ignoring greenhouse gas emissions, these are things that cause sickness and death among human populations. In the United States, according to an MIT study last year, about 52,000 Americans die prematurely each year as a result of toxic air emissions from power plants in the United States. It's about 1,000 less than the number that die from emissions from transportation fuels. So if we look at that as a sort of a combined equation, 105,000 Americans a year dying prematurely as a result of emissions from our energy sources. Next slide, please. Okay, this table, this graphic, I should say, demonstrates to me as I look into the future. So we've talked about what we have, where we came from, what we have. Now I'm looking into the future. In 2012, approximately 20% of the world's population lives in energy poverty, meaning they have no access to electricity. Staggering to think about that, but 1.2 billion people, 3 to 4 times the population of the United States, live worldwide without electricity. For this reason, as we look into the future and we talk about the water, energy, food nexus, so this is an important thing in terms of sustainability, these are important resources, and the interconnectivity of all these three is intimate. So you cannot talk about one and ignore the other two. We need energy. We need energy to create food. We need energy to get access to water for communications, for transportation. These are all important things that we need. Obviously, the specter of climate change affects these systems. So this interacting of this nexus is critical for us as human beings, as humankind, as we go forward in this world. Next slide, please. So talking about Energy 2050, what will the future landscape of energy look like? I think we heard from Niel about the Shell scenarios, and they have a really terrific, if you go to the website, there's actually an abundance of additional information about those scenarios. It's very, very interesting to read. I'm positing what I see as plausible events in the future energy landscape in the United States specifically, and in the world more generally. So you can go ahead and click me there. So advanced fossil fuels will continue to provide the bulk of our energy needs. This is in the foreseeable future, can't be ignored. Renewable energy currently doesn't possess the economic capability to provide baseline energy for us as fossil fuels can. So improvements to our fossil fuel system are crucial. So improving and having innovation in terms of our use and practice of fossil fuels is critical. So it's not about turning away from this tool that has been so critical to us for so long. It's finding ways to be better at it, finding ways to be more efficient with it. Next, please. Renewable energy will dominate the global energy landscape by 2035. Now, this is really in terms of new capacity additions. So what we're talking about here is, I'm going to build a new power plant. What are my choices? Coal, probably not a good choice. Natural gas, a better choice than coal, certainly. Or renewable energy. In fact, wind and solar have outpaced the growth of other energy sources in the U.S. over the last couple of years. Wind and solar both have outpaced the growth of new capacity additions in the United States in the last couple of years versus fossil fuels. So this is not an impossibility. This is very likely. Next, please. Advances in energy storage will enable technological leaps. Now, what we're seeing in the renewable energy sector and in primary energy as itself is energy storage technologies have been advancing very quickly. And you look at really in terms of R&D and investment in that sector has been massive in the last 3 to 5 years. And with Elon Musk building his big factory and he's going to build all these great new batteries for us, we're excited about that. And the reality is that the ability to store energy will relieve both burdens for new capacity and give us the ability to provide that baseline power with emission-free or carbon-free energy technologies, including solar and wind. Recently read an article that suggested that grid defection, so to speak, or the ability of everyday consumers to unplug from the electrical grid is no more than 2 years away in some U.S. markets, and as many as 8 or 10 in other U.S. markets where electricity prices are particularly low. But because of that reason, next click, please, solar will probably be the most disruptive technology to our existing system, especially in terms of centralized energy generation. We'll see a move away from centralized energy generation and a move toward more distributed uses or distributed forms of energy generation. Solar, and I'll talk a little bit more about why solar will be so disruptive and why the capacity is there, but generally speaking, it's because it's a plentiful resource. It's a very simple technology, easily accessible, easily deployed and quickly deployed, and it works, believe it or not. You haven't got the memo yet. I can show you some that works. So next click, please. So sustainability and human needs overcome non-sustainable practices. So we'd like to see this carry over throughout every sector, but specifically because of the repercussions associated with climate change with energy. This is a critical need to U.S. populations today, that we start to move toward more sustainable practices. This is why, as I stated earlier, in the future, when we have decision makers deciding what new generation resource to build around, the consideration of renewable energy sources we hope will be at the top of that list. renewable energy is preferable to other forms of energy because it is emission-free. Next, please. The democratization of energy. This is one of my favorites. I talked about the end of centralized energy generation to a great extent, or I shouldn't say the end of it, but the transformation of a lot of our primary energy system away from centralized control. So again, you give individual consumers the ability to go to Ace Hardware, use their credit card, and unplug from the grid. They will likely do so. If you give small businesses and corporations and factories the ability to do so, they probably will as well. So you'll start to see this shift away from centralized generation toward distributed generation. Next, please. So here's our energy resource comparison, and this is part of the reason why I believe that solar will be the most disruptive technology in the near future. You look at what the resource capabilities are. The bubbles that contain the fossil fuel reserves represent the entire global reserve, or at least as we understand it recently, for those resources. And the solar bubble, the big sun in the middle, that's 1 year of the potential for the solar resource. So you can see that from a resource standpoint, as a renewable energy resource that's easily deployable and easily used and transported and contemplated, it provides a greater opportunity than every other energy source combined on planet Earth. If we look at the little orange bubble that's sort of on the left side of the sun there, that shows world energy use in 1 year, about 16 terawatt hours, about 4 times what we consume in the US. But it suggests, once again, that there is plentiful solar resource that can be harnessed to provide for our energy needs without the negative repercussions associated with the environmental impacts. Next slide, please. Virtual power plants. So as we look into the future, then we talk about how are we going to go about utilizing our energy system to reduce our footprint, but still have reliability, still have the goods and the services that we want available to us, still enable economic growth. The use of virtual power plants is a concept where you're basically using a computer to manage your system. You have various forms of distributed generation resources. You see there, you've got some houses with solar panels on the roof. You've got some windmills. You've got a ground-mounted PV system. But the idea is that this entire system can be integrated and intelligently managed using a computer. In Germany, they're building these systems in some areas, in some cities and towns, building larger and larger virtual networks centered around this type of mentality. And this results in a thing that we call transactional energy, once again, moving away from centralized control of energy generation. Individual consumers are automatically, electronically buying and selling energy as they need, generate, or consume it. So for example, I have a wind farm and some solar panels on my farm. I'm producing today more energy than I'm using. Maybe I have a battery in my barn that I'm using to store energy. The next town over needs more energy than they're generating today. Well, they can access the stored energy that I have, or the excess energy that I'm generating, and automatically, transactionally conduct that energy to them and sell it to them without me having to get up and ship an invoice or agree to the transaction. So this idea of transactional energy, I guess, supports as well that we are bees, and we can exist communally and cooperatively together with one another in terms of our energy system as well. So the idea that it takes a village, it does take a village, not to raise a child, but to make energy. And we can use these tools, advanced information technology, the ability to control and reduce those losses, as I talked about, that 61 to 68% that we're generating, that we're losing, we can start to reduce that using systems like this, integrated smart grid systems, virtual power plants. Next one, please. So I took the case, if you looked at the US, could you provide 100% of the US energy demand in 2030 with solar? It's again, using the assumption that about 70% of our energy system now is still based on fossil fuels. Could you generate 4,000 terawatt hours a year with solar? Yes, you could. It would require about 2 terawatts of solar. How much land would that require? We're talking to geographers, right? 15,000 square miles, about 0.4% of the land area in the lower 48, 10% of the state of Montana. And that would power 100% of our energy needs, both in terms of electrical energy and transportation energy by the year 2030. With current economics, if I were building that system today, if you gave me a contract and said, go build me 2 terawatts of solar all across the US, it cost about $3 trillion, roughly speaking. Less than a year of our US government spending, and this is one of my favorite numbers of all time, 0.5% of the global over-the-counter derivatives marketplace. I love that number. $700 trillion market. Rapidly deployed. Typically, power plants take years and years. If you want to build a nuclear plant, I think we're building one now for the first time in about 30 years. It takes a long, long time. You have to resource site, you have to build it where you can get the resources, build it where you can access the fuel. Not with solar. Solar you can pretty much put anywhere where the sun shines, which is just about everywhere. I was driving across a guy's farm one time in Central Florida that we were buying to build a project on. And he said, "How do you know my land is good for solar?" And I stuck my hand out of his truck and I said, "Well, look, the sun shines right on it." Pretty much all there is. If I don't have somebody shading me, if I'm using energy or not and the sun is shining on me, I have a resource I can use. Resources are available, supply chains are simple. There was an article done last year, I think it was done by MIT, that talked about the natural resources or the raw materials required to do this, required to power the world's energy from solar. Could it be done, for example? And they found out that yes, it could be done. It would require approximately 1 year of the global supply of copper and silver, but you could do it. Next slide, please. So what would it look like? That's about what it would look like in 2030. I don't know if you can see that graphic very well, but it's not a big area. Now, technically, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't put it all in one place because you'd have big transmission losses moving it all over the place. But one of the nice things about solar is it's a quantum device. It doesn't hurt anybody. No moving parts. Set it and forget it, right? Ron Popeil, right? You could build that as a generated resource all over the country. Rooftops where you can use them. If you can't, put it on the ground. It works. There's plenty of land. I've been driving around the country for a few years now. I'll tell you, there's plenty of land. Next one. So we look at the United States. What is the solar resource? The potential for the solar resource in the U.S. is plentiful. I live down in Florida. And 4 or 5 years ago, I used to have people tell me, "Oh, you can't build solar in Florida. There's no sun." And I used to think, I'm going to die of skin cancer, and you're telling me there's no sun in Florida. But as you can see, there's plentiful solar resource in the United States. Even in places like New Jersey and Maine, they get pretty good solar resource. Germany, until recently, had led the world in solar deployment and penetration of solar into their power grid, and their radiation is similar to that of New Jersey. So it's not as if they're basking in the sun and sunbathing, but the resource is available, the solar resource is available. Next one. And the most important part, why do we choose solar? Well, we choose solar because it produces the energy we need without the emissions, without the bad stuff, so to speak, right? The toxic air and water emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you did build 2 terawatts of solar, based on what the current U.S. fuel mix is, this is about the avoided emissions that we'd see per year. So the numbers are just staggering by any means. We would meet the required reduction for greenhouse gases that the IPCC has recommended, but more importantly, you'd save 100,000 lives in terms of toxic air and water pollution. Down in the bottom, I talk a little bit about the economic impact of doing such a thing. These are position papers that were written in a place that I spent some of my early formative years in the industry at the Florida Solar Energy Center. Savings to taxpayers and health and environmental impacts. This was estimated in 1992 by one of my early mentors, a guy named Dr. David Block, down in Florida, rest his soul. Calculated those costs of those health and environmental impacts sans global warming. So that does not take climate change into consideration. That is purely the impact from toxic air and water emissions on U.S. taxpayers. So this is effectively the medical costs of treating the people that get sick and die from these emissions, and the environmental cleanup associated with the downstream use of those materials. U.S. jobs created, that's assuming that you manufactured all the technology in the U.S., which is probably not likely, but that number of jobs represents job years in U.S. economic speak. And the equivalent number of trees planted is about 5 million trees a year. Stay pretty busy doing so. Next one. So here we are looking at the whole world. What if you powered the whole world with solar in 2030? So this was a project done, Land Art Initiative. You guys can check it out online. It's pretty cool. They have all kinds of cool maps and graphs they put up there. In particular, this graphic contemplates 100% of the world's energy needs provided by solar, and how much surface area would it really take. And these little boxes show, and again, this is 100% of transportation fuels and primary energy, electricity fuels. And it shows how much of the surface area would be required to do so. It's not a lot. Not a lot. And that's using the current technology, which is advancing every year. So if we look into 2030, 2040, 2050, We're looking at advances in innovation that are 2 or 3 years away that will likely have big effects on the change within these marketplaces. One more, and here I'll wrap up. So what does the future really hold for us? I don't know. I like to say I have an understanding of where it's going and the decisions that we can make. I have a tendency to think that if given the choice between non-sustainable practices and sustainable practices, that we will choose the sustainable path. But most likely, it's going to be a combination of all these things, a little bit of helter-skelter, a little bit of reactionary to crisis, but ultimately reducing our footprint, right? Living as bees more cooperatively and more healthy with one another. And we can do so. Probably not going 100% to solar as much as I'd love that, but we do have the resource and the capability. So it's not an ugly picture. We can change this. We can make this happen. We just have to make the determination to do so and go execute. So thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. And now Professor Michael Bradshaw.
I realize I'm standing between you and lunch, so I've come a long way, so I'm going to have my time at the lectern, but I will try and keep it brief and to the point. If I could have the first slide, please. Okay. Many thanks for the opportunity to come and speak. I currently work at a business school, but those who know me know that I'm a geographer through and through, and I hope that will become clear from my slides. If I could have the next slide, please. My starting proposition actually is the previous session. This is a summary from the IPCC synthesis report published the other week. In that, climate change is here, it's real, but there are opportunities both to mitigate its impact and to start to get ready to adapt to its consequences. So if I could have the next slide, please. And what I want to talk today about is what I call global energy dilemmas. And I particularly like this quotation from John Holdren, which I think shows us the intimate relationship between energy, economy, and environment. Without energy, there is no economy. Without climate, there is no environment. Without economy and environment, there's no material wealth, no civil society, no personal or national security. And the problem is that we've been getting the energy our economy needs in ways that are wrecking the climate that our environment needs. So the stakes are high. If I could have the next slide. What I've been doing in my work around global energy dilemmas is to pose this question. Can we have secure, affordable, and equitable energy services that are environmentally benign? I mean, after all, it is energy services that we consume. We don't know about the origins of those services in the room today, the lights that we wish weren't on, the projectors which are showing the images. We can't tell you what the origins in terms of the mix of energy is for those. We're not interested. What we're interested in is the services they provide. And one of the earlier speakers talked about, I think it was Jim Baker, the complex and intimate relationship between energy and environment, between energy security and climate change, so that energy policy is climate policy and vice versa. But I would argue that there's a missing link in this, and that is the role of globalization. And I think that's been writ large in many of the discussions today, where we've seen maps of population. We've talked a bit about the changing pattern of economy. That to understand the dynamics behind the global energy dilemma, we need to understand the consequences, particularly the geographical consequences of globalization. So have the next slide, please. So when we come to the issue of energy security, which in my neck of the woods is what it's all about, we tend to talk about the trilemma, which is actually a phrase used by a former CEO of Shell. The trilemma is trying to balance then energy, economy, environment. The needs for energy security, which the IEA here is defining as the uninterrupted physical availability at a price which is affordable, we could ask affordable to who, while respecting environmental concerns. So to balance energy security with affordability and sustainability. The sustainability is not just about climate change. We've heard as much about air pollution as we have climate change this morning. The difference between the two is that air pollution is a locally specified problem. It may be transboundary, but it's local, whereas climate change is global. And the climate does not discriminate about the origins of the carbon that is emitted in the atmosphere. So I have the next slide. So what I want to do is to use something called the Kaya identity, which is probably familiar to most of you. It's the issue behind much of the climate modeling. It's now used quite explicitly by the International Energy Agency. It's also used by the EIA. It breaks up the elements that drive energy demand and with that total emissions from energy. And so what I want to do is to use it as an integrating framework, but I also want you to think of each of the elements of the Kaya as a different geography, a geography which is the carbon intensity of energy, a geography which is energy intensity, our ability to turn energy into economic output, a geography which is the geography of GDP, of economic output, and one that we've heard a lot about this morning, the geography of population. And as in the GIS, it's necessary to layer those geographies one upon the other and look at the interactions to understand what are the key drivers influencing energy towards the year 2050. So I have the next slide, please. This is what we're interested in, which you probably can't see. It's a map of greenhouse gas emissions. I have to say, I have seen more maps per minute this morning than in any conference I've ever been at, which is a good thing. Like many, I spend too much time listening to economists with lots of graphs, not geographers with lots of maps. So anyway, here we are. This is the starting point. The current distribution of carbon emissions per capita. And you'd see a familiar north-south divide. If we could turn to the next slide, which for some reason, can you press the button again? Okay. This is from BP's statistical review, and it's showing the global energy mix. And I'm not going to dwell on the detail, but what I want to focus in on what is actually grey on the slide, which is the role of carbon in the energy mix of the different major regions of the world. And in particular, the last column, which is showing you the role of carbon in Asia. And to say that the major challenge, the most immediate challenge as we move forward towards 2050 is coal. Getting coal out of the global energy mix is critical. And we've already heard about the paradox, actually, that in some ways those particulates are good for mitigating climate change, but there are all sorts of other reasons why we want to get rid of coal. If we turn to the next slide, which is also from BP. This is from a different publication. All the oil companies are now in the business of producing outlooks to the future. Shell obviously led the way, I should say. This is Energy Outlook 2035. So eventually they'll get to Energy Outlook 2050, but not for a few years. But it's looking at emissions by region and carbon intensity. And if you look at the graph which is on my left-hand side, you can see already one of the key messages. The future energy growth is in the non-OECD. And how that energy growth is met is critical to our ability to address climate change. There's a dotted line there which actually shows the decline in emissions required to stay within the IEA's 450 scenario, 2 degrees C. You can see that that is going in a completely opposite direction to BP's projections as to what is happening. We do over time see patterns of declining emission intensity as we move through this evolution of energy mix, which was talked about in the previous discussion. But we can see there that China and India are in carbon-intensive stages of their energy system at the moment. Could I have the next slide? BP also talks about the evolution of energy intensity in the global economy over time, as the global economy becomes more effective at turning energy into economic output. And it does this in a number of different ways, not least through economic restructuring, moving towards a more service-oriented economy. But both the trends of energy intensity and carbon intensity are not leading to change at anywhere near the rate that we need to address the challenges of climate change. So if I had the next slide. So we're galloping through this, but I think this should be quite clear, the message that's here. This is from the Energy Information Administration, and it shows their projections. In this case, we're getting to 2040, so we're nearly there. But it's also looking back to a period in the previous decade when the non-OECD passed the OECD as a major emitter. So what they're saying is between now and 2040, energy use in the non-OECD countries grows by 90%. Last week, the IEA published its World Energy Outlook, and they are actually at 2040 now, and they said that between now and 2040, 60% of new energy demand growth will come from China and India, and at the middle of the next decade, India will pass China. So while our eyes are on China, we shouldn't forget that India is catching up very, very quickly, particularly when it comes to population. Could I have the next slide? Of course, what is driving this is a global shift in economic output. We've already heard about the positive consequences of the alleviation of extreme poverty, the fact that now, according to World Bank estimates, 17% of the world's population lives on $1.25 or less, and that's significantly down. In 1981, it was 52%. So progress is being made. But we also are well aware of the changing distribution of economic activity in terms of the top economies in the world. So China in 1980 was ranked 12th in the world, and in 2013 it was second after the US, and no doubt sometime soon it will pass the US. Whether because China's going up or the US is going down, we'll have to see. But of course, this is having a significant impact then on the distribution of economic activity and energy demand. Can I have the next slide? But we shouldn't forget, and this has already been mentioned, that today nearly 2.4 billion people still use traditional biomass energy for cooking, and nearly 1.6 billion people do not have access to electricity. I'm sure none of you in the room can contemplate a world without access to electricity. Ban Ki-moon has pointed out that energy is the golden thread that connects economic growth, increased social equity, and an environment that allows the world to thrive. And we may ask ourselves why energy access was not a Millennium Development Goal, and hope that next year when they agree on a new set of development goals, they will acknowledge the centrality of access to modern energy services to poverty alleviation. Can we have the next slide? I don't really need to dwell on this because we've talked it at great length. People demand energy. Population growth then is a key indicator of future energy demand. Urbanization is critical to that process because cities demand more energy, they generate more greenhouse gases. And so we need to be aware of the energy and carbon consequences then of population change. There is a school of thought, and it's not advocating population control as an approach to climate change, it's simply pointing out that there is a potential win-win by controlling population growth rates in those parts of the world where they remain high. And you can do this, for example, through the provision of modern energy services, which help, for example, in increasing the level of female participation in education and in the workforce, that we know that has an impact on population growth rates. So you need to create virtuous circles as a consequences of providing new energy services. Okay, have the next slide. So if we look at the Kaya identity, we can take each of these elements and think about the geographies now and the geographies in the future. We've talked about the fuel mix, carbon intensity, the carbon-intensive nature of the fuel mix in Asia, where the majority of future energy demand will be between now and 2050. And we have to come up with a plausible narrative for getting rid of coal, for promoting lower carbon sources, perhaps in the first instance gas, but lower carbon source, but then in the end, zero carbon sources. We talked about energy intensity and how the economy is constantly improving the level of energy intensity, but not at a rate that will get us where we need to be. And how there's this global shift in the geography of economic activity and in future population growth. So we have the next slide. This is from the IPCC report, and it's using the elements of the Kaya identity to look at the causes of both increases and decreases in global carbon emissions. And the message that you can't quite see in the detail is that until recently, carbon intensity of energy was a positive force. We were decarbonizing globally, but at the moment we're not. And of course, I've come from a continent that has managed to go from lower carbon gas to burning more coal. In part thanks to the fact that shale gas in the US has driven coal out of the US. It's come to us, but that's mainly because our carbon pricing system is broken. So to the next slide, and to conclude the section on global energy dilemmas. I think we face three challenges. First, to improve energy intensity, to focus on efficiency and demand reduction. Secondly, to reduce the carbon intensity of energy use, this idea of a smarter use, for example, of fossil fuels. Technologies like carbon capture and storage are going to be critical in doing this. And thirdly, to achieve the above in ways that are secure, affordable, and equitable. But of course, they can't threaten economic growth. So if I could turn to the second element of my presentation, the global energy paradox. Can I have the next slide, please? And I particularly like this quotation from Homer Dixon. The best case scenario and the worst case scenario turn out to be the same thing, business as usual. The best we can hope for is that we don't run out of cheap oil. And the worst we have to fear is that we will continue to burn fossil fuels, including oil, as we've burned them in the past. And I think that's very much where we are now. If I could have the next slide. This is from World Energy Outlook, published last week. The IPCC estimates that we have a 50% chance of meeting the internationally agreed goal of limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees C. The world cannot emit more than a total of around 1,000 gigatons of CO2 from 2014 onwards. And we are fast eating up this carbon budget. In the new policies scenario, which is the enactment of existing policies moving forward, the entire budget is used by 2040. So by 2040, we've used all the carbon budget we had to keep us within 2 degrees. Look at the next slide. Now, there are lots of different scenarios, relatively few forecasts out there. But we've heard about the Shell scenarios, the BP outlook. Exxon is now in the game of producing its own outlook. And of course, the World Energy Outlook itself produces various scenarios, including the 450 or 2 degrees scenario. Most of the scenarios from oil companies do not get you anywhere near the 2 degrees centigrade. And of course, it's quite obvious why that might be the case. So if I have the next slide, which is somewhat cheekily drawn from Shell scenarios, and it's not one that Niel used in his presentation, but it's another way of he had that graph where we had the emissions profiles of the two scenarios and the necessary profile. So in a sense, the exploratory scenarios are not where we're going, they're potential possible futures, and that's all they are. But what this shows is that those possible futures lead us some way away from where we need to be, the normative scenario, the world of 450 degrees. And what we lack then is a plausible narrative to get us from where we might be heading to where we need to be. And perhaps the previous speaker has provided you with one credible narrative. It's for you to decide. Personally, I don't believe that any one technology is the answer. We're going to have to invest in all of the above, as someone else said. So I could turn to the next slide then. What this issue of the carbon budget raises is this notion of unburnable carbon. No more than 1/3 of proven reserves of fossil fuels can be consumed prior to 2050 if the world is to achieve the 2 degrees goal, unless carbon capture and storage is widely deployed. And Carbon Tracker define unburnable carbon, fossil fuel energy resources which cannot be burnt if the world is to adhere to a given carbon budget. Now, I've got two slides here. I'm not going to dwell on the detail, but I'll just have the next one, which is about a paper published in Energy Policy by colleagues at UCL. And the only thing I'd point out is if you accept the carbon budget, you accept the notion of unburnable carbon, and many don't. But if you do, it is very important to think about whose carbon doesn't get burnt. So one of the findings of this modeling scenario is that Arctic oil plays only a minor role in a scenario with CCS, and with no CCS, there is no Arctic oil. We don't need to go there if we take climate change seriously. But the other thing, and I think we see the stresses already with a lower oil price, there are large parts of the world that rely on exporting fossil fuels to generate income. And so there will be geopolitical consequences from climate change-induced fossil fuel destruction. And we need to start thinking about that. And the next slide. Last week we published a parallel report looking at the role of gas as a bridge to a low-carbon future with similar findings. Gas has a role to play. That role is different in different regions, and by 2035, gas is becoming part of the problem, not part of the solution. With CCS, the gas bridge is extended. So we need to start thinking about the impact of climate change policy on the incumbent fossil fuel energy system. And I don't think we're doing enough of that at the moment. So finally, I've got two slides to conclude. It's a bit murky, but energy scarcity in the world of 2050. It's not a world where fossil fuel physical scarcity is a problem. We have more than enough proven reserves. It's possibly a world where the cost of energy is an issue, of economic scarcity, and it's certainly a world of geopolitical scarcity in a sense. If you think through the consequences of unburnable carbon, whose carbon does get burnt? The lowest cost producers. Those lowest cost producers today are in a particularly unstable part of the world, which suggests that maybe they won't all get burnt in that place. Maybe we will go to the Arctic for geopolitical reasons. But what I want to argue is that in 2050, it will be environmental scarcity that imposes constraints on how we satisfy our energy services. We will not be able to consume fossil fuels in the way that we have today. We don't necessarily have to. Some of the technologies are now emerging. We'll have a much more varied energy mix, and we will also hopefully have solved many of the issues around the issue of equity. So I could have the final slide. So in 2050, the global energy challenges are quite different in different parts of the world. So to keep things simple, the high energy societies, us, particularly you need rapid decentralization of energy services to achieve an 80% reduction by 2050. That is because you cannot continue to use the lion's share of that 1,000 gigatons, because you've got to make room for the emerging economies in the developing world. It's a question of climate justice. We have developed by making the historical emissions. The emerging economies then need to provide energy needed to fuel economic growth, the implicit social contract many have with their populations, and improve living standards while constraining and then reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So China's acknowledgement of the need to peak emissions by 2030 is a start. And then finally, we shouldn't and must not forget the residual, the developing economies, to ensure sustainable energy access for all, certainly a long time before 2050, and to provide the future based on sustainable prosperity. One thing to leave you to think about over lunch. In this scenario, there is no such thing as business as usual. You think back to Homer Dixon's paradox. If we continue to do what we're doing, we're way beyond a 2 degrees world, and that will not be business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Mike. And a round of applause for our whole panel. And now I'm going to turn the podium over to our symposium chair, Chris Tucker.
So, because of all the wonderful maps and wonderful speakers that we've had, we're a little bit behind schedule. We're going to break for lunch. Mr. Cardillo, who is our speaker after lunch, gets to eat first. Otherwise, he'll be speaking with his mouth full, and nobody wants that. The lunches will be picked up in the faculty room, which is behind this curtain. You can either go through the curtain or around. There we go. And just come back to your tables to eat, and we'll clear and we'll get started. We're going to try to keep it down to 30 minutes, though obviously we'll just see how it works out. And then we'll go to our next speaker. On the cards, who's filled out their pink card? Who's done? Who's started? You ran out of room. Great, great, great. So here's your next 2 assignments. The green card. We heard Jerry Dobson talk about Bowman expeditions. If you need to learn more, pull out your smartphone and Google Bowman expeditions. Where are the 5 places on Earth that we should have a Bowman expedition and why? Right? Participatory mapping with people on the other side of the planet so we can better understand what's going on there. And the blue card is the top 5 trends, okay? So read all your friends, share your cards at lunch, and steal from your friends. And I want them rank ordered this time, right? Out of your 10 best ideas and everybody else's 10 best ideas, I don't care where you beg, borrow, and steal them, rank order them. Does that make sense? Excellent. Let's break for lunch. Thank you very much.